as you've seen, tonight is something different. It is a chance for the voters of Iowa to question the candidates directly. Next up, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Good to see you. Great to see you. Hi,
everybody. Interesting weekend for you. Boston Globe, endorsement.
Right.
Des Moines Register, endorsement. Maybe the best accolade. President Obama gave an interview, talked about this race, seemed to get more into it than he has in the past. He said, "You're, quote, wicked smart, knows every policy inside and out." Sounds like an endorsement to me.
Well, I was really touched and gratified when I saw that. You know, people here in Iowa remember we ran a really hard race against each other. And then I had the opportunity when he asked me to serve as his Secretary of State. And it not only was a great working relationship, it turned into a real friendship. And he knows how hard the job is. He knows it firsthand. So I really appreciated what he said and how he said it, because it was a positive reflection on what we have to get done and how hard it's going to be. And therefore, the stakes in the election are really high. And I think that's what voters are beginning to really tune into, starting here in Iowa.
He says also in there, you get undue criticism. And he says, and by the way, I have some regrets about my campaign and some of the things we did. Was that surprising?
Yes, that was surprising. You know, I really appreciated him saying that, because he said that he had that great line, which I love. I think he said something like, you know, he said, I was like Fred Astaire and she had to do everything I had to do, only she was Ginger Rogers doing it backwards in high heels. And I thought that was a really a very sweet remark. But, you know, I understand that you get into the arena and you are going to get pummeled and pushed and criticized. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it was absolutely necessary to try to build on the progress that we've made under President Obama against great odds, and that we've got to do everything we possibly can not to let the Republicans rip away the progress and turn us backwards. That would be such a loss for our country. We need to build on it and go further, and that's what I'm trying to do in my campaign and talking about all the issues that I think are in the minds of the people I speak to across this state.
And you get to do that tonight. We're going to get questions
Good.
right from the voters. 2008, we're talking about. Here you are again, another election. Praise and promise coming your way, but another nail-biter
Right.
with a self-described socialist named Bernie.
Right.
How did that happen?
Look, it's a great country, despite what one of the Republicans says. It's a great country, and we are all, on the Democratic side, having a spirited debate about the issues we care about. I'm so proud. You've seen my two Democratic opponents, and the three of us have run a campaign talking about the differences we have on issues. That's totally fair. That's what we want you to know. The other side is not talking issues, they're talking insults. So I'm proud of the campaign we've run and what we've put out there before the American people. And it's a tough campaign, and it should be, because it's the hardest job in the world. You have to pick a president and a commander-in-chief, and you want to really vet the people that are running. And I'm really having a good time going around talking and listening to folks. And on Monday, the people in Iowa get to be the first people in the world, Chris, to express an opinion about who should be president and commander-in-chief and what they want to see as our nominee to go up against the Republicans.
So let's do that right now.
Okay,
let's help them. We have Taylor Gipple, Iowa native, first-time caucus goer, leaning Sanders, but has a question for Secretary Clinton.
Let me help you up here.
It feels like there's a lot of young people like myself who are very passionate supporters of Bernie Sanders. and I just don't see the same enthusiasm from younger people for you. In fact, I've heard from quite a few people my age that they think you're dishonest, but I'd like to hear from you on why you feel the enthusiasm isn't there.
Well, I think it really depends upon who you're seeing and talking to. You know, today in Oskaloosa, I spent time with about 10 high school students who are enthusiastically working for me. I see young people across the state who are doing the same. But I'm totally happy to see young people involved in any way. That's what we want. And we want to have a good primary to pick a nominee, and then we want to have everybody join together to make sure we win in November, which after all is the purpose of this whole campaign. And so, you know, look, I've been around a long time. People have thrown all kinds of things at me. And, you know, I can't keep up with it. I just keep going forward. They fall by the wayside. They come up with these outlandish things. They make these charges. I just keep going forward because there's nothing to it. They throw all this stuff at me, and I'm still standing. But if you're new to politics, if it's the first time you've really paid attention, you go, oh my gosh, look at all of this. And you have to say to yourself, why are they throwing all of that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I've been on the front lines of change and progress since I was your age. I have been fighting to give kids and women and the people who are left out and left behind a chance to make the most out of their own lives. And I've taken on the status quo time and time again. I have had many, many millions of dollars spent against me. When I worked on health care back in '93 and '94, and I don't know if you were born then. I can't quite tell. But if you'd been around and had been able to pay attention, I was trying to get us to universal health care coverage working with my husband. Boy, the insurance companies, the drug companies, they spent millions, not just against the issue, but against me. And I kept going. And when we weren't successful, I turned around and said, at least we're going to get health care for kids. And we got the Children's Health Insurance Program working with both Democrats and Republicans, and 8 million kids have insurance because of that today. So you've got to keep going. You can't give up. You can never get knocked off course. That's my hope for you and for all the young people who are getting involved this first time. Don't get discouraged. It's hard. If it were easy, hey, there wouldn't be any contest. But it's not easy. There are very different visions, different values, different forces at work. And you have to have somebody who is a proven fighter, somebody who has taken them on and won and kept going and will do that as president. That's why I hope you'll reconsider.
We have another voter for you to work on, Elena Dietz, an Iowa native, first-time caucus goer. She says she's also leaning toward Bertie, but she's giving you a chance with a question.
Great.
Elena.
Secretary Clinton, earlier this month, Vice President Joe Biden said you are a newcomer to the issue of income inequality, while praising Senator Sanders for his authentic voice on the issue. How do we know that you will keep this issue a top priority?
Well, I have the greatest respect for the Vice President, but I think it's fair to say that I have a 40-year record of going after inequality. And not only economic inequality, racial inequality, sexist inequality, homophobic inequality, the kinds of things that go after people to put them down and push them back. So since I was a young lawyer, my first job in the Children's Defense Fund, I took on the problem of juveniles in adult jails. What kind of inequality can you imagine that is worse than that? Taking a child and putting them in with adult prisoners. And we went right after that to change that. I went after schools that were being turned into private schools that were really there because they wanted to escape integration in the South. I went by myself down to Alabama to do investigation because, again, inequality stalks our education system. I was on the Legal Services Corporation. I chaired the board. Inequality is also about not being able to get a lawyer. You can't afford them. You can't stand up and have your voice heard and have your case adjudicated. So I have a really long history of taking on all kinds of inequality. And when I went to Beijing in 1995 and said, human rights were women's rights and women's rights were human rights. That was a statement about inequality, economic inequality, education inequality, cultural inequality, every kind of inequality you can imagine. Now, when you focus just narrowly on economic inequality, I've also been in that fight. I was in that fight during my husband's administration, and let's remember what happened there. At the end of 8 years, we not only had 23 million new jobs, what was most important is incomes grew for everybody, not just those at the top. More people were lifted out of poverty, incomes rose in the middle and working people. And today in Knoxville, in my town hall, I called on a man and he said, "We never had it so good, except when your husband was president, because we tackled income inequality and produced results. Not talk, action, and that's what I will do as president."
Another question for you, Secretary Dick Goodson. He's the chairman of the Des Moines Committee on Foreign Relations. He's likely going to caucus for you next week, unless you mess it up right now.
Oh, okay, I'll try not to.
Your question, sir.
Madam Secretary, before I ask my question, I have a quick comment, and that is that I was a lukewarm person for you before the Benghazi hearings. I watched all 11 hours, every second of it, and came away from that a gung-ho supporter of yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I woke up one night thinking that maybe I could see, if Donald Trump was sitting here, maybe he'd punch Gowdy out. That was my point. Okay, here's the question. Practically all of the comments that have been said for all three candidates tonight, probably 99%, have been on some form of domestic policy. And yet, you know, as the former wife of a president and as the Secretary of State, that the President of the United States is going to spend more than 50% of his or her time on foreign policy issues. Right. So therefore, I think it's important for the public to kind of get a sense of where you may be coming from across the board philosophically. And the way I look at it is you could have a scale of, say, 1 to 100. And on that scale, you would have non-interventionist on one side at 1 and total interventionist on the other side as 10. As you think about all the issues that you've confronted as Secretary of State, and then as the possibility of looking at issues into the future, where do you think you'll land on that scale of 1 to 10?
I'll tell you what, I want to start by saying thank you for asking about foreign policy, because you're absolutely right. In fact, President Obama in his interview said something about that. He said, you know, you don't get to pick the issues you work on when you're president. A lot of them come at you. They come in the door whether you open it or not. And he even gave the example of working on his State of the Union, being at the desk in the Oval Office when one of his aides came in and said, the Iranians have just captured 2 of our naval vessels and have taken our sailors prisoner. You can't say, oh, okay, don't bother me now, I'll deal with that later. You've got to immediately be able to switch gears. You've got to do all aspects of the job. So let me tell you how I think about it. I think it's imperative you do your very best, every president, and certainly I will, to avoid military action. It should be the last resort, not the first choice. To use diplomacy, even if it's slow, boring, hard, to continue to persist and be patient to get results. And that you also should use the enormous capabilities that we have to project our values around the world, our cultural values, our freedoms, our human rights, and respect for the dignity of all people. I want to give you 2 quick examples. When I became Secretary of State, what President Obama and I found was that the Iranians were on their way to a nuclear weapons program. This despite all of the bluster from the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney administration. They'd mastered the nuclear fuel cycle, they had built covert facilities, and they had stocked them with centrifuges that were rapidly whirling along, trying to create enough highly enriched uranium to have a weapon. Now, our choices were, oh my gosh, just fulminate about it, or turn our backs and just figure out that somebody else was going to do something, or try to get up a new strategy. We chose the third. We said, look, we've got to get the world behind us to force them to the negotiating table. So I spent 18 months putting together the coalition that imposed international sanctions on the Iranians, that forced them finally to begin negotiating with us to get an end to their nuclear weapons program, to put a lid on it. It took 18 months to get the sanctions. It took me about another year to travel around the world convincing other countries to actually obey the sanctions. And then I began the negotiations, testing whether the Iranians would actually come and seriously negotiate. And then Secretary Kerry and the President did a great job bringing the agreement into fruition. You cannot imagine how tense it was, because a lot of our friends and partners in the region basically just wanted to end that program by bombing them. Just bomb them, send them back a couple of years, just stop it. I spent a lot of my time explaining to our friends why that was not a good idea. And we got the negotiations successfully done. We did put the lid on. So that's how I thought about it. Another quick example. We had another unfortunate spate of rockets going from Gaza into Israel in 2012. I'm on the phone with the Israelis. They're trying to knock them out of the sky with their missile defense system, but they're still landing, and everybody is really worried that, one of them is going to hit a big group of people, take out a big building somewhere. So the Israelis are telling me, look, we got to go back in. We have to have a ground invasion again in Gaza. I'm saying, no, please, don't do that. Let's try to figure out how do we resolve it. We don't think we can resolve it. I flew from Cambodia, where I was with the president, to Israel, middle of the night, go see the Israeli cabinet, work with them on what they would accept as an offer, go see the Palestinian president, work with him to make sure he'd back it up, go back to Jerusalem, finalize the deal, fly to Cairo, meet with President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, hammer out the agreement, announce it at about an hour before the deadline that we were facing. They got a ceasefire. There was no invasion. That's what you have to do. So every situation is different. So I want to make sure I stay as close as possible to the non-intervention. That's why I say no American ground troops in Syria or Iraq. Special forces, trainers, yes. Planes to bomb, yes. No ground forces. Every part of this has to be done in accordance with our values, our interests, and our security in partnership with other countries.
All right, 2 points of, Secretary, 2 points of pushback. One general, one specific. Your critics will say they see the Obama administration, of which you were, of course, a part as Secretary of State, as a period where now things are less stable around the world, certainly in the war on terror. Specifically, Senator Sanders earlier tonight said, yes, a lot of experience, but it doesn't always translate into the best judgment, and he cited your vote on the war in Iraq. How do you respond to those two criticisms?
Well, first of all, I have a much longer history than one vote, which I've said was a mistake because of the way that that was done and how the Bush administration handled it. But I think the American public has seen me exercising judgment in a lot of other ways. And in fact, when that hard primary campaign was over and I went to work for President Obama and he ended up asking me to be Secretary of State, it was because he trusted my judgment. And we worked side by side over those 4 years. And think about where we were when he became president. As I just said, Iran on the way to a nuclear weapon, which would have destabilized the entire Middle East, created an arms race, the likes of which we have never seen. We had hundreds of thousands of American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our best allies and friends in Europe and Asia were really put out with us because of the way they'd been treated by the Bush administration, and were very skeptical that the United States was a good ally any longer and wanted to lead the world toward peace, prosperity, and security. I spent so much of my time getting back the confidence and the trust of our friends and allies around the world. So I think we made a lot of progress. Now, do we have a terrorist threat? Yes, we had a terrorist threat on 9/11 before President Obama took office. Yes, we were attacked. So this is not something new. This is a long-term challenge. That's why I've laid out a plan to defeat ISIS and the radical jihadist terrorist networks that I think has the best chance of achieving that. There is no time in human history where everything is going well. And we now live in a very interconnected world where we know everything that is going on, and where people look to the United States to help. So we have to be leading, and that means we've got to be smart about how we try to assert our power so that it is constructive, makes a difference, and does lead to greater peace and prosperity. But I am very proud of my record as Secretary of State and what we accomplished, not only on specific trouble spots, but advancing women's rights, advancing gay rights, advancing religious freedom, internet freedom, and so many of the other values that we hold dear.
We have another question for you about the example that the United States provides. On our left, Aram Tariq Munir. She's an American Muslim from outside Des Moines. She served in the U.S. Air Force. She says she's undecided, and she has a question.
Hi.
Hi, Secretary Clinton. America today is formed by a very diverse group of people, and with the current rise in Islamophobia and the Black Lives Matter movement, how can we make sure that United States today is that we protect the constitutional rights of all groups of people without marginalizing any one community? Specifically, as a mother of 3 young children, as an American Muslim, how can I make sure that this country is the best place on earth to raise my family?
Thank you. And thank you for your service in the military.
It's my pleasure.
And one of the most distressing aspects of this campaign has been the language of Republican candidates, particularly their frontrunner, that insults, demeans, denigrates different people. He has cast a wide net. He started with Mexicans. He's currently on Muslims. But I found it particularly harmful the way that he has talked about Muslims, American Muslims, and Muslims around the world. And I've called him out continuously about that. It's not only shameful and contrary to our values to say that people of a certain religion should never come to this country, or to claim that there are no real people of the Muslim faith who share our values, and to have the kind of dismissive and insulting approach. It's not only shameful and offensive, which it is. I think it's dangerous, and it's dangerous in several ways. It's dangerous because American Muslims deserve better, and now their children and they are the target of Islamophobia, of threats. I've met a number of parents who have said their children are afraid to go to school because they are worried about how they will be treated. And we cannot tolerate this. And we must stand up and say, every person in this country deserves to be treated with respect. And we must stand up against the bullying. But there's another element to this that I want to mention. I was recently in Minneapolis where I met with a big group of Somali Americans. And I sat down and talked with them, and they shared some of the very same concerns you just did. But they are also on the front lines of trying to protect their children from radicalization. They are on the front lines in Minneapolis of working with law enforcement to make sure that what they see and hear, they report in case there are any problems. We have to protect ourselves in America in a unified way. That means making sure our Muslim friends and neighbors are part of us. They are with us. They are on the front lines of defending themselves, their families, their children, and all the rest of us. And the same is true with Muslims around the world. We need a coalition that includes Muslim nations to defeat ISIS. And it's pretty hard to figure out how you're going to make a coalition with the very nations you need if you spend your time insulting their religion. So we need to stand up and point out how wrong this is.
All right, we have another question for you, Secretary. Maria Diaz, Drake Law School student who says she's deciding between you and Senator Sanders. Maria Diaz, you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi.
Good evening, Secretary. Secretary Clinton, when you are elected the next president of the United States, what will you say to Republican voters?
that I want to be the president for everyone. And I believe that is exactly what any president should do. You know, Chris Cuomo's father said one of the smartest things. Well, he said many, many smart things about politics. But you might remember he said, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. You know, you can say all the kinds of things you want in a campaign. And we are drawing distinctions with the Republicans, and we should, because I have very deep disagreements, as I just pointed out, with a lot of what they're saying and doing. But once the election is over, we must come together to work to solve the problems facing our country. That is what I did. I did it as a first lady when I worked, as I said, to get the children's health insurance program. I did it to reform the foster care and adoption system with one of the most partisan Republicans in the House, Tom DeLay. I did it when I was in the Senate. Nearly every Republican I served with co-sponsored legislation that I introduced and we worked to pass. And I did it as Secretary of State, reaching out, talking with Republicans all the time about what we were doing, enlisting their support, getting their advice. So I know in order to deal with the problems I want to get the economy working, creating more good jobs, getting incomes rising, making sure we build on the Affordable Care Act, get costs down, but improve it, get to 100% coverage, everything I want to do. I want to start from the belief that we can find common ground, and that is exactly what I intend to do. And I see my friend Tom Harkin sitting there, and he knows from his years in the Congress, you always have to hope you can find common ground. You've got to bring people together like he did. The Americans with Disabilities Act, what an amazing accomplishment. And
I have a question for you as a point of pushback. You were talking earlier about how it's difficult to form a coalition with people who are being insulted at the same time. Let's apply that to the Democrats and the Republicans. You say you want to work with them, but you were quoted not too long ago when you were listing people that you saw as adversaries, NRA, health insurance companies, probably the Republicans.
Yes.
They did not like that when you said that, and it makes them feel that, well, Secretary Clinton doesn't like us. Why would she work with us?
Well,
understandable.
Yeah, well, Chris, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, and I consider them worthy adversaries, because they are. They have their set of objectives. We have ours on the Democratic side. But that's why I gave you a short overview. I worked with all of them. You know, when I'm actually in office, they say really nice things about me. We have a whole long list of the nice things they say, what a good colleague I am, how easy I am to work with, how willing I am to try to find common ground. And then when I run, oh my goodness, it's just unbelievable. So I have no problem in saying, yeah, we have political differences, we're on opposite sides, but we're going to work as hard as we can. And here's what I know about how to get that done. It takes building relationships, and that is one of the hardest things to do in politics over ideological and partisan lines. So I'm going to be just giving them all bear hugs, whether they like it or not. We're going to get together. We're going to talk about what we can do. Maybe we can get something done together. If not, maybe I can find that slice of common ground to find somebody who will work with me on achieving a goal that we want. So that's the way the process should work, constantly looking for ways to make a difference and putting together the coalitions within the Congress to pass laws.
So what is it inside you that can separate the human feeling of doing the Benghazi hearings and then going back to that same group of people and saying, okay, you know what, let's put that in the past? It sounds a little hard to do.
Well, I don't know, I came out pretty well, so I think it would be very... It would be very gracious of me to go back and talk to them.
All right, let's get you another question. Zach Piper grew up in West Des Moines. He says he's undecided.
Okay.
What's your question for the Secretary?
Hi.
Secretary Clinton, kind of on the same issue as the bear hugs. I think one thing they might have a hard time bear hugging with the other side, and certainly a concern that a lot of Democratic voters have at this point as far as going to the general election and looking forward to working with Congress is the Benghazi issue. So how are you planning on dealing with that going forward, not only in the general election, but also if you became president working with Congress?
Well, look, this is only still an issue because the Republicans want to keep it an issue. They know it, I know it, and I think it's very easy to answer, and as the gentleman who stood up before said, if you watched any of it, I answered every question. And at the end of it, the chairman said, no, we didn't learn anything new. Well, because there was nothing new to learn. Why? There'd already been 8 investigations, most of them by Republicans in the Congress, the House Intelligence Committee, the House Armed Services Committee. And what did they conclude? That there were problems that night, but they were ones that we should look at not from the perspective of placing blame or pointing fingers, but how do we make sure that never happens again? That is what I said immediately after it happened. That's why I put together an independent board to tell me as Secretary of State what I needed to know and what we could do to fix it. And I accepted all 29 of their recommendations. And we were on the way to implementing them when I left, and that has continued. So I am well aware that for partisan political purposes this continues. But let me tell you why this makes me, it makes me sad. It makes me sad because we've had terrorist attacks many times before in our country, haven't we? And we've had American, both civilians and military personnel, the subject of attacks. When Ronald Reagan was president in 1983, our Marine barracks, our embassy were attacked in Beirut. More than 250 Americans were killed. The Democrats didn't make that a partisan issue. We were horrified. We were heartsick that Americans doing the work they were sent to do, civilians and military, were murdered by terrorists. So the Democratic Congress worked with the Republican president to say, what can we do? How do we fix this? Fast forward, my husband was president. Al-Qaeda attacked 2 of our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. Car bombs, blew them up, killed 12 Americans and hundreds of Kenyans and Tanzanians. Madeleine Albright was secretary. She said, we've got to get to the bottom of this. She did the same as I did, commissioned an independent report. When the report came out, she made it public. I made the report I commissioned public. That's the only 2 times those reports have ever been made public. So, again, it was terrible. What can we do? How do we fix it? It wasn't the subject of this kind of partisan, media-driven attack. People wanted to come together, and even after 9/11, when nearly 3,000 Americans and others who were working in New York City, the Pentagon, on that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, were killed, we formed a commission. We said, what went wrong? What can we learn? And then we moved on to try to do better. So look, I understand that they will try to make this an issue. I will continue to answer, and my best defense is the truth. And that's what you will hear from now until I'm elected president.
On that issue, the Des Moines Register, as we said earlier, gave you an endorsement. They did question your judgment, though, when it came to the email issue. They said, and you know this, but for the audience, in 2008, quote, when she makes a mistake, she should just say so. This weekend, they said, that's a lesson that you have not learned. Yes, you apologized, but only when you needed to, not when you first could have. Fair criticism?
Well, I think that look, I was delighted to get the Register's endorsement, and it was a very generous one. And yes, I think that's a fair criticism. You know, I had no intention of doing anything other than having a convenient way of communicating, and it turned out not to be so convenient. So again, we've answered every question, and we will continue to do so. But maybe being faster, trying to scramble around to find out what all of this means, I probably should have done that quicker.
You're willing to say it was an error in judgment? You should have apologized?
No, I'm not willing to say it was an error in judgment, because nothing that I did was wrong. It was not in any way prohibited. And
not apologizing sooner, I mean.
Well, apologizing sooner, as soon as you can. But part of the problem, and I would just say this as not an excuse, but just as an explanation, when you're facing something like that, you got to get the facts, and it takes time to get the facts. And so when I said, hey, take all my emails, make them public, that had never been done before, ever, by anybody. And so we've been sorting our way through this because it is kind of a unique situation. I'm happy people are looking at the emails. Some of them are, frankly, a little embarrassing. you find out that sometimes I'm not the best on technology and things like that. But look, I think it's great. Let people sort them through. And as we have seen, there is a lot of interest, but it's something that took time to get done.
Earlier tonight, we played Senator Sanders, your ad, and asked him a question about it. One of the ads that you're putting out here in the last run up to the caucuses. We'll now do the same for you.
Okay.
Here's the Senator's ad.
Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
I think that's great. I think that's fabulous. I loved it. And now, look, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. And we need a lot more poetry in this campaign and in our country. So I applaud that. I love the feeling. I love the energy. I obviously respect Senator Sanders greatly and appreciate what he has done in this campaign. But I believe that I'm the better person to be the Democratic nominee and to be the President and Commander-in-Chief of the country because...
Got another question for you. Brett Rosengren, he's from Logan, Iowa, is going to school, works as a supervisor for a janitorial company, says he's undecided, has a question.
Great.
Secretary Clinton,
It's
sorry.
okay.
I can see why they gave you this question. I just wanted to know which of our previous presidents has inspired you most and why?
You can only pick one. One you can pick. Sorry, let me jump your question.
You know what?
One president.
Right.
One.
Okay.
Just one.
Okay. Sorry, President Obama. Sorry, Bill. Abraham Lincoln.
Oh.
Abraham Lincoln. You know, wow. When I think about his challenges, they pale in comparison to anything we have faced or can imagine. You know, more Americans died in the Civil War than, you know, the wars of the 20th century put together. So here was a man who was a real politician. I mean, he was a great statesman, but he also understood politics. And he had to work to put together, you know, the support he needed to be able to hold the country together during the war. And while he was prosecuting that war to keep the Union together, he was building America, which I find just an astonishing part of his legacy. The transcontinental rail system, land-grant colleges. He was thinking about the future while in the middle of trying to decide which general he can trust to try to finish the war. That's what I mean when you got to do a lot of things at once. And what could be more overwhelming than trying to wage and win a civil war? And yet he kept his eye on the future. And he also tried to keep summoning up the better angels of our nature. You know, he was willing to reconcile and forgive. And I don't know what our country might have been like had he not been murdered. But I bet that it might have been a little less rancorous, a little more forgiving and tolerant, that might possibly have brought people back together more quickly. But instead, you know, we had Reconstruction, we had the reinstigation of segregation and Jim Crow, we had people in the South feeling totally discouraged and defiant. So I really do believe he could have very well put us on a different path. And as I say, our challenges are nothing like what he faced, but let's think ourselves about not only what we have to do right now, especially to get the income rising in America, especially to make college affordable, do something about student debt, keep health care growing till we get 100% coverage and so much else. But let's also think about how we do try to summon up those better angels and to treat each other, even when we disagree, fundamentally disagree, treat each other with more respect and agree to disagree more civilly and try to be inspired by, I think, the greatest of our presidents.
Secretary Clinton,
Thank
you very much for taking the opportunity.
Great to see you.
Appreciate it. Pleasure.
You doing okay?
Everything's great. Thank you. We want to thank Secretary Clinton, Governor O'Malley, and Senator Sanders, and everyone who made this town hall possible. Our thanks to our partners, the Iowa Democratic Party, and Drake University, of course, and thank you all, our audience, for watching and participating. The caucuses, just 1 week from tonight, we'll be here. CNN will have complete coverage. I'm Chris Cuomo in Des Moines. Don Lemon picks up our coverage right now.